Okay, I'm gonna make this video quick because I don't have much video left on here. Speaking to Ruben yesterday. Okay, Ruben is going to be taking the exhaust manifold off on his car. Okay, and he's not really quite understanding, well, he could understand when we explained it to him, the principle behind why the exhaust manifold is bolted to the intake manifold. Now, he has an integral head, so that means the intake is staying there regardless. And on the integral head, bits of the exhaust manifold are cast in and point down. Underneath the intake manifold, it's like a box. Bloop. Okay, so if this red thing is the intake manifold, it bolts right up underneath. And if you were able to take it out of the car, there's a small port here for one exhaust. There's a double wide port there for two more exhausts, so that's three. Skip over here, you got a double and a single. And in the center, he has a circle or a square depending on the year. And these particular bolts, minus a circle, bolt to those flanges hanging off the head, and that's your exhaust. It leaves through this box looking thing, comes out the bottom and goes out. Now his intake manifold, which is part of the head, has a circle on the bottom of it. So now we have the head upside down, and it has a big gaping hole in it just like that. So if you were to pull this exhaust box off, you couldn't start the car because you would have this big hole on the bottom. That big hole is bolted to that box like that with the bolts. These are the bolts that Ruben loosened and had loose for the last 3 or 4 years. I think it was 3 bolts or 2 bolts, whatever it is, on one side. Now they run a gasket there. Now here's where things get a little tricky. This is what I cannot find out. I don't know if all those mating surfaces run no gasket like a factory setup on like an 8-cylinder, and they sell you an aftermarket gasket to put in, or if it had a gasket to begin with. That I can't tell. Okay, but what I do know, or what I did feel has happened, is right over here is where his intake manifold gasket leak is. So the question was, why isn't the exhaust coming up in here? If you were able to take the exhaust or the intake manifold out of the way with the big hole in the bottom, the top of the exhaust manifold is going to be perfectly sealed. So you say to yourself, why does the intake have a big hole in the bottom? This is the exact reason, because when you bolt it on and you take the carburetor off and you look down in there, you're looking at the exhaust manifold. On a 6-cylinder, you have no way to transfer the heat from the inside of the engine or anywhere around it onto the intake manifold. So when it's cold weather or the car's warming up, the fuel needs to come down and it's going to hit this hot spot, and it's going to atomize, vaporize, however you want to word it. So that means the particles are going to get real small, and that'll allow it to go into the cylinder and burn better. Simple. Okay, but if you compromise this gasket, as soon as you start up the car, this becomes a massive vacuum leak out on the bottom. Which, if you look at the way the setup is, I can understand why you'd have a hard time finding it. It's not like a carburetor gasket, which is like 4 or 5 inches higher than that, that's out in your face. This is kind of like buried. And it's going to be a shit job. I already explained it to him, but he's got to do it. And either the gasket is compromised or the bolts were left loose so long that the manifold warped. So even when he tightened it down, he still has a leak. That's why I think, if I remember correctly, after he tightened it, the car got a little better, if you remember, but was far from cured, and I think that's the reason. Now, what I wanted to explain to him was, I got the intake manifold laying here on the AMC. This big flat area on a factory intake has a crossover from this side to the other side, and it flows exhaust because it goes right into the exhaust valve, if you guys remember me doing the heads, and it touches underneath the intake. So that crossover actually keeps the bottom of the intake warm for the same principle. And in some cars, in the older cars, like in the 60s, you ran that tube down in there, and that tube came up and went to your choke on one side and went to a vacuum source on the other. Well, it went to your choke on one side, which had a vacuum source on it, and then the other side was filtered, is what it was. So when you started up the car, it drew clean air in. It went into these tubes, which the exhaust was blowing across and warming, came up, and that air went across the bimetallic spring, and that's what opened up your choke. So now this car does not have a heat crossover at all. They're not really good for performance. This is what they call the air gap. The air gap just means there's an air gap. That's all it means. So this particular car doesn't have what we're talking about with Reuben, but so that's where we stand with that Reuben. Next video is going to be talking about this coming back off.